Hi, so welcome everybody. I'm really excited today. Our second Zoom talk, and it's going to be about deliberate practice. Charles is here again, and I'm Christina McGrath. My company is WellFit Living, and I am an international health and yoga coach. I do retreats all over the world, but I specialize in peak performance and then also yoga for athletes and nutrition coaching and training. And I'm combining efforts with Charles to talk about all this really cool stuff about flow state, about practice, about habits. And I'm really excited about our talk today about deliberate practice and how we can develop kind of our focus in order to kind of achieve the vision that we want to achieve. So, Charles.
Well, I'll say good evening to everybody. And for those of you who don't know me, I've been a designer for the last 35 years. I now do sort of speaking internationally and some coaching and some training, which I thoroughly enjoy, I have to say. But what we're going to talk about tonight is this thing called deliberate practice, which I know isn't a great name for what it is, but what it is has actually changed enormously how athletes train, how musicians train, how you can actually achieve sort of excellence or expertise in a particular field. And what it does, I think, that we were talking about earlier, is it answers or begins to answer the question that is talent natural or is it actually nurtured? And that's the sort of central question that particularly one particular science, which is Aaron Erickson addressed, is asking, you know, are you born gifted, or do you rather, can you actually learn to do it? And his conclusions are really interesting. He starts actually, interestingly, with the example of Mozart. You know, was Mozart just a child prodigy and born with this amazing skill with being pitch perfect? And what they found after quite a bit of research is that that actually, if you nurture a child in the right way, in the right kind of practice, at the right time, and particularly the time is very important, then you can teach certainly pitch perfectness. You can't necessarily teach them to be an expert in their field. But they found that actually it's not so much, and there's one great quote, which is, learning isn't about reaching one's potential, it's rather a way of developing your potential. And that's basically what we're going to talk about. And the other thing to bear in mind is that you can't just pluck it out of a book and do it in 5 minutes. It's not easy and it takes time. And the other reference, which is really interesting, is Malcolm Gladwell's reference to 10,000 hours. And of course, the 10,000 hour rule is not quite correct, because you have to do the 10,000 hours in the right way. And what he also found is that, particularly when studying violinists, is that the 10,000 rule doesn't really apply. It more applies to the sheer quantity and the purpose with which you actually practice. So there's a couple of quick examples, if I can, or little stories, if you like. In 1908, Johnny Hayes was the first Olympic marathon runner to actually go sub 3 hours. And everyone thought that this wasn't possible. And the same with Roger Bannister, is that before Roger Bannister, people believed that that to go sub 4 minute mile was actually going to be completely and utterly impossible for the human body. And yet he achieved it. And after he achieved it, I mean, we now have a world record of 3 minutes 43. So it just goes to show that actually it's more to do with what happens in the mind as well as the body, rather than just what the physical body is capable of doing. I think you had, Christine, you had an example of Bo Eason, is that right?
Yeah. So I don't know if you guys have heard Bo Eason. I've listened to him in a couple podcasts, but he's legendary, and he used to be in football. But his big thing was being the best. He had this thing where he proclaimed, I think he proclaimed from a very young age, that he was going to be one of the best. Gosh, I forget what it was in football, but it was like quarterback or something amazing. And he was going to be the best at it from a very young age. And he declared that, and he drove people with him. And one of his brothers actually had probably more talent than he did, he even explained, but he had the will and the deliberate practice and that drive and that vision of being the best. And it's really funny. I feel like he's always saying that vision that he had, and he even goes down to say that he could see himself doing these amazing, amazing things. And then they actually started to match themselves up later in life as he got better and better. But his big thing was there's no plan B for your A game.
Yeah.
So I think
that's also that
that's really interesting.
I think most of us sort of think that if we do more and more and more practice, and the example would be driving. If we just keep doing it, we get better at it. And that tennis, for instance, if you play a lot of tennis, then you get your skill level to a certain point, and then it just plateaus.
Yes.
And you don't get better because you're not applying anything. And, you know, driving is probably the example. When I went with a friend of mine once to a racetrack and he drove me around the racetrack, I realized that there was a whole other level of driving that I had no idea even existed. And you can't get to that level unless you apply some specific, deliberate, step-by-step rules. Now, the way that we all practice, of course, is that we do something, we get competence, just good enough. And then we stay there and we keep doing it. And it's enjoyable and it's fun, but it doesn't progress. And that's what particularly Erickson calls naive practice. Yeah. And that's basically the first stage, but that's what most of us do. Reading as an example. I mean, there's so many different examples we play.
I have a question about that then.
Yeah.
Do you feel like then, because a lot of us are just going to drive to, be at a level that we're safe. We're not going to be professional drivers. Obviously, we just settle on that level. The same with tennis. But if you have that vision, like Bo Eason did or whatever, of that, that top level that you want to be, obviously that motivation and that vision
that's the next level.
And that leads,
some people get and some people want that level, and that's the next step that that he sort of suggests that has to happen. Is that first of all you need to decide that that's what you want to do, or somebody decides for you. For a little child, then that's also possible. But the motivation is the tipping point. Yeah. Basically, that's what moves you on from just this sort of naive practice. And that takes you on to something else, which he calls and is called purposeful practice, which is the second sort of level. And that's where people become sort of much more competent at what they do. And there are very, very specific rules that he's sort of distilled from a lot of research on how these things happen. And those rules, which I'll summarize at the end, but just to sort of go over them briefly, is this thing about, first of all, being motivated, but you must have a goal. You must have a plan. And it's not sufficient just to say, I want to be. You also, and we'll also come back to this in a moment, is you need to have a vision of what that level might be like. So if you're Usain Bolt, then you have a vision of how it feels and how it looks and how it is to actually sort of accelerate in front of everybody. The same with, I always quote the example of Alex Honnold, the climber, who basically has a completely and utterly clear vision in his mind of the exact climb. He's the guy who climbed El Capitan in free solo. So the first step in purposeful practice, as opposed to naive practice, the thing that moves you on is basically having a goal, having a plan, and breaking the big plan down into smaller chunks, and then specific chunks that get very specific, so that you actually have step-by-step goals. And that's the first part, because you have to be specific and you have to be realistic about everything you want to improve. So therefore you must have a vision of what that improvement needs to be and where it needs to go and how it works and how it feels as well. Because a lot of things that we're talking about here are very physical as well. They're not just mental, although some of them are mental. Even if you're a violinist, for instance, that's part mental, but it's also very physical. Just the ability to move your left hand fingers particularly at incredible speed and with incredible accuracy. There are no frets across the main stem of the violin. So you have to be very precise in your positioning. So that's physical and mental. And the second really big sort of point is about focus, is that you have to focus on that goal, and you have to have a very high level of concentration. And again, sort of looking at people like Alex Honnold, the climber, is that he is completely and utterly and totally focused on just being in that moment. And this relates to the previous talk about flow, and getting right into the moment, focusing on the goal and excluding everything else. The other guy the other book I really like is a book called The One Thing, where he says, you know, if you look at your day every day, what you must do is you must sit down in front of it and say, in front of your list, and say, what is the one thing that I can do today that will make everything else easier or better or more efficient? And you focus on that first, and that's how you prioritize. And I think...
So I have one question just pertaining to the other talk that we had the other day about finding flow. Do you feel like talking about deliberate practice or talking about purposeful practice going into deliberate practice, and even just talking about Alex, the climber, and his practice prior to climbing out Cap?
Sorry, I just lost you.
He almost had flow. I mean, he obviously had flow states and focus previous to that, which is kind of a purposeful practice, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And so again, it's all related to this thing that we'll come to in a moment, which is about having sort of mental representations.
Exactly.
That you have to be able to, or visualizations, whatever you want to call it. I mean, we've all seen sort of Tiger Woods sitting, or squatting, I should say, looking at the putt that he's going to make and absolutely focusing on exactly how that golf ball will feel and will look as it goes into the hole. And that's part of that sort of training. And it's to do with that focus. And you can see how the two things come together, that you have to have a goal and you have to focus on the goal, and you have to focus on the need to improve. But the other thing, that it doesn't work unless you've got self-criticism and unless you've got feedback.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have feedback, which is the third sort of step within it, if you don't have some sort of feedback, if you don't know what you're doing wrong, then you're going to continue to do it wrong. And that will become, there's this the terrible phrase, which is practice makes perfect, which it doesn't. Practice makes permanent. It doesn't make perfect.
I like when you say that, practice makes permanence. I think that's very valid.
If you keep doing things in the same way and it's not quite right, then you will get used to doing it in the same way and not quite right. The only way you can change that is if you get some sort of feedback. That may be self-feedback or self-criticism, but the next step that we'll come to in a moment is about actually what he calls deliberate practice. And that's where you have somebody else, might be a video, might be a person, or whatever it is, or a music teacher, or whatever, an instructor or mentor, that will actually sort of look at what you're doing and break it down into the smallest possible components, which is the other thing that, in fact, that was in my blog this week, is about making these one tiny little improvements to everything. And if you get that across the board, this was the Team Sky cycling team who implemented this policy of focusing on every single little tiny thing, even to carrying the pillows that the cyclists used at home to make sure that they slept properly. So you have to have that sort of feedback, and you have to have that attention to detail. But the biggest thing of all, the number 4 sort of category in all of this is basically pushing outside your comfort zone. Now, there's a lot of talk about this, and particularly in neuroscience, because particularly there's a guy called Bo Lotto who has very rightly identified that in order to think creatively or be creative, because he talks mostly about creativity in the mind, you have to move out of your comfort zone. You cannot stay within your comfort zone. You have to move into some sort of uncertainty. And it's the same, I mean, Christina, you know much better than I do that in order to progress as any sort of athlete or anything like that, you have to stress the muscles, you have to stress the mind, you have to push just a little bit beyond, but I think within this, there is a sort of sweet spot. If you go too far, you end up injured. Or let's say that if it's a mental thing, then you will end up stressed with burnout. So what you have to do, though, is you have to go beyond your comfort zone and outside of the comfort zone to actually make a difference, because otherwise nothing changes, nothing happens. You remain doing the same thing in the same way. And that's very true, I think, for also assumptions, for how you think. If you keep doing things the same way, well, I mean, fairly obviously, nothing changes, does it?
I think, and this goes back to kind of what we were talking about last time when you had that beautiful little diagram of your flow state of you guys didn't see it. It was great.
Yeah.
But it was the amount of skill related to
related challenge.
To challenge. Yeah, so there has to be a certain match. And I was thinking about this, and this is why, you know, with sports, is that's why the Super Bowl is so exciting, is because the teams are actually matched well as well. So, you know, there's a certain stress level that outside that matches your skill level, that just pushes you that little bit further to jump up to that next level. And it's just a tiny bit outside your comfort zone, but you're not stressed, so your mind's going in another direction.
You're just frozen again, fortunately. But yes, I'm afraid you froze. But so it's this thing about sort of on the one axis you have your skill, on the other axis you have your the challenge, the amount of challenge. The flow state is somewhere right in the middle, where you're balancing just a little bit more challenge than you have skill, and a little bit more skill than you have challenge. And if you can, and that can work at any level. I mean, even if you're just a beginner, you can still get into flow states in that sort of sense. If you can balance that point at which you're just pushing a little bit beyond where you're comfortable. And where this sort of goes to then next is that the fact that then it sort of begins to, first, there are two things to say, one about this. First of all, that the brain and the body are highly, highly adaptable. And there's a whole section that we won't have time to talk about today, which is about homeostasis, that your body and your mind desperately want to get you back to a simple plateau level. That's what they do, because they're energy efficient, basically. And so if you push a little bit beyond that, then it says, oh, this is the new level, and it takes you up to that level. But you have to maintain that level, and then you have to go a bit beyond and a bit beyond. So it's all the small steps. If you go too far, then you're stressed, and then you get injured, or you break down, or whatever it may be. And I think that the very few of us really push much beyond sort of good enough. And we tend to think that, you know, that's okay, I've reached a reasonable level, that's plenty, that's enough. So the next stage really about sort of fulfilling sort of potential, and it's not fulfilling potential, it's creating potential. Because it isn't, according to all of these scientists and all of these researchers, it isn't a gift. It's something you can learn to do. And interestingly, because the brain is so malleable and so adaptable, not in the same way as the body, it has to be said, is that it can and does adapt. It's plastic, what they call plasticity. But the next stage up that you get to then, of course, is this thing called deliberate practice. And that is basically, it's the same sort of formula, if you like, as purposeful practice, with the same 4 steps, but you have the intervention then of an outside influence that can observe what you're doing. And that, in the example of golf or rugby or of probably American football, it's all videoed. Everybody's sort of looking in detail what happened, where, when, how. And that sort of then gives you the feedback that you need in order to sort of move forward each time. So I think the thing is that it's basically not about filling a sort of a genetic destiny. It's about taking control of your destiny and shaping basically your potential. And I think that's what deliberate practice is all about. And that's why it's been so readily adopted by particularly in sports, but also in business now, really, really heavily in business. The other example, I guess, is the All Blacks, who implemented something very, very similar. For those of you who might be in the USA who don't know, the All Blacks are the New Zealand national rugby team who are incredibly successful for many, many years. And they implemented also a system of deliberate practice and also incremental practice, constantly, refining and improving just by tiny, tiny margins every single thing they do. And not just what they do on the pitch, but everything they did in the whole of their lives. So it was all about mental attitude. If you get the mental attitude right, then the physical attitude will follow. That was the principle there. So that brings us to there's two parts actually on this. One is that in terms of just explaining the plasticity of the brain, there's a brilliant study that was done by I can't remember. Oh yeah, Eleanor Maguire on London cabbies. Now, London cabbies, of course, that drive black cabs are quite a special breed because they have to learn something called the knowledge, where they have to learn. I think it's a 5-mile radius from Charing Cross of every single street and every single landmark in London. And that's an enormous task. What they found happened with the cabbies is that once they'd learnt the knowledge, that actually their brains were changed in terms of shape as well. The hippocampus, which is a little sort of seahorse-shaped thing, right, so you've got two of them, right in the back, sort of inside, that are responsible for spatial awareness, actually increased in size. And they had a much better spatial memory, but that was also physically changed. The same also they found with violinists is that, particularly elite violinists or first violinists, is that normally the areas that of the brain, which I don't know if you've ever seen a diagram of a homunculus, but it shows where every single bit of your physical aspects is connected to particularly the corpus callosum. And what they found is that with violinists, that the areas where that control the fingers or that are responsible for the fingers, and it's not the only area, it's not just there's one single area for each bit, it's much more general than that, but they did find that the areas that control the fingers were expanded, were physically expanded as well, which amazes me, really. And that affected their memory, that affected their spatial awareness. But the point that this is all sort of coming around to is this thing about mental representations. So what cabbies have learned to do is to increase the sort of mental representations that they have of how they can visualize something. And this is the same for chess grandmasters. It's the same for probably all elite experts of their kind, is that they build general, sort of, not general, but very specific patterns, and therefore are much more able to recognize the patterns and how they form. So when a chess grandmaster, for instance, plays 30 simultaneous games, he can visualize the board, but he visualizes it by the patterns of the pieces that make sense. So it's very much related to meaning as well. So attaching visual concepts and visual representations, or not necessarily visual, but let's say mental representations, to specific meaning is what actually sort of, in the end, designates that difference between you and I and an elite athlete or a chess player or a mathematician or whatever, is the mental representations, which are pattern making. Yeah.
So coming along with, so the cabbie drivers and the chess players, and we talked about this the other day, is that while they were learning and they were building these parts of their brains to deal with different kinds of patterns that they would encounter, it actually physically increased the size of the area that was being used.
Yeah, the hippocampus.
As well as the mental capacity that they could access.
Correct. So, I mean, I don't want to unduly simplify the workings of the brain as I understand it, but my sort of understanding of it is that there are multiple regions that are affected by even the smallest intervention or movement or thought or anything. It's not one region, but there are certain regions that they know, and they can tell by ECGs, by all sorts of other sort of means, by fMRI. They can see that certain areas are light up, if you like, when certain functions are done, be it language, be it logic, be it moving an arm or whatever. That they can see quite clearly happens. But it is much more complex than that, because I don't think you can easily say that, okay, so you have this bit here, and if I move this finger, that bit of my brain suddenly lights up. It's a bit of that, but it's not all of that, because there's also sort of, why am I moving? What's the meaning of it? What's the memory of it? What's the color of it? What's the texture, the feeling? There's so many other things that come into play that are all the different regions. And nobody...
But we do know that we have the ability, one, to increase the capacity of our knowledge for patterns and developing different areas of the brain. And then we also know with both of those studies, I think we mentioned, or we were talking about it before, that the cabbie drivers, as soon as they stopped driving, they actually lost that as well.
They did. It shrinks back, which is... Yeah. But here, I'll give you a little game that you can all play at home. Are you ready? So if I read out this sentence, right? Nothing her bank to very get of was the sister, by tired and having of silly beginning do Alice to of. Anyone know what that means? No. Well, I'm assuming no. If you do, you're very, very, very clever. And this is, the reason that it makes no sense is this is just random words. You haven't been able to chunk together meaning. And that's actually one of the opening lines of Alice in Wonderland, but I've just rearranged the letters. Now, the reason that I give you this is to say that language works in, the way we learn language, I think, works in a very similar sort of way. You start with just random letters and you learn the sounds, or not necessarily letters, but you learn the sounds, you make up the word, you identify something, you point at something. Gradually you build mental representations. And those mental representations are like little chunks that then start to fit together into patterns. So the sentence should be, Alex was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and having nothing to do. Now, that makes perfect sense. And it makes sense because you can chunk together the meanings by mental representations or visualizations, whatever you want to call it, so that you have found a way of collating things together to make meaning. And in expert level, once you get sort of to beyond deliberate practice, where you're actually sort of at the very, very top of your field, that core of knowledge is vastly increased. And that's why chess grandmasters can play, and sometimes do play, 32 simultaneous games, only because they can see the patterns of moves on the board. Now, if you give, and they did the test, if you give chess grandmasters just a board with randomly placed pieces, their memory is no better than somebody who doesn't play chess to identifying where the pieces are. It's only when they have meaning, when they have pattern, when it actually sort of starts to correlate into some sort of patterns that they can assimilate into giving meaning, so that they can work out what the next move is going to be or whatever. So, and that's really, I mean, that fascinates me personally, but I don't know if it fascinates you, but it certainly fascinates me.
So I think when you were saying that, though, that is the direct relationship when we were talking about the clarity of the vision, whether it's a goal or vision or anything like that. That's the meaning.
Exactly.
And then the practice.
Exactly. I mean, there's a whole talk we could do about sort of event, meaning, purpose, why we string things together into stories, and but that it really is another whole discussion about how we create meaning out of really what is just completely meaningless random events, and that creates culture, that creates society, that creates lots of other things. But that, with only a few minutes left, we're definitely not going to get there, so I won't even go there at the moment. For next
time. But let's so do you want to kind of go over, just in a nutshell, like how I mean, what I derived and what we've talked about before is obviously the main thing between purposeful practice and deliberate practice is the ability to have accurate feedback. Because like you said, and one of the gentlemen in the call said as well, he's like, perfect practice makes perfect. But you can also have practice, which is not so great, and you're just doing, you're just getting along.
Well, then you're repeating the same things, and then the definition of madness
it
is
makes
doing
permanence.
The
so the idea is
you're going to get the same result.
Yeah, so the idea of coming from purposeful practice, which is what a lot of us, I feel like we do on our own, and this is why I feel like sometimes people come to me for coaching because they're like, I'm not sure about my feedback. Like, I don't know exactly if I'm doing this right, if I should be doing something different, then you tweak some things. And now they're into a more purpose or deliberate practice. So I'm finding that that's probably where both of those differ is the feedback process.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, because if I think back to when I was about 14 or 15 and I wanted to become a highboard diver, you get to a certain point and you're reasonably fit, you're reasonably strong, you're reasonably athletic, you can do some of the moves. But to actually sort of get to the level of the very, very top level, you must have somebody, particularly diving is actually a very good example, because you're in the air, you're completely disorientated, you're tumbling, you're turning, and you're spinning. And you're not sure exactly what it might be that isn't quite right. So you need somebody to observe what you're doing. And they may say, I mean, I remember the coach there saying to me once, he said, look, all you have to do is just hold your stomach in. Just hold, pull your core right in and you will turn a bit faster. And you thought, oh, wow. And then all of a sudden everything changes and then you move on to the next stage and the next stage. But if I can sort of bring it back round, I think there's a few, because we're going to be out of time in a moment.
Yeah, you have 2 minutes.
Oh, sorry. Is first of all, you need the motivation to want to do it, or you need to be encouraged to do it. And then the key sort of takeaways really are the 4 key stages that you must go through in order to implement deliberate practice. And that's that you must have well-defined, very specific goals, and they must be broken down into small bits. You must focus your attention specifically on the task at hand, and that means being in the moment, which is very similar to flow. And then feedback. You must have feedback. The most important of all of them, though, without any doubt, is that you have to move out of your comfort zone. Otherwise, you will never change. It will never improve. And that's fine for most of us, to be honest. That's just fine. I mean, I don't aspire to being a racing car driver. I have a friend who does. He's a bit of an idiot, but that's okay. But I don't aspire to doing that, and I'm quite happy to drive moderately okay. So I don't need to learn how to sort of do a 4-wheel drift and all the rest. It's just not what I need for day-to-day life. So that basically, I think, getting out of your comfort zone is probably the most important. And I think we've all experienced it. Whenever you want to change something, it's nerve-wracking, it's difficult, it makes you very sort of anxious about it. But when you succeed in that change, and I think that's what we're going to talk about next week, if you'll join us, is about change and about changing habits, because one of the great difficulties, I think, of any change is that, yes, you can implement your will and you can change something, but to actually make it a permanent change is a very, very difficult thing to really properly achieve. And you can only do that by using sort of certain very simple basic techniques. And I think the guy that we're most going to refer to is a guy called James Clear, who wrote a book called Atomic Habits. And it's a brilliant book, really simple, really clear. And that's pretty much, I think, all we're going to really get through. I've still got loads of notes.
I know. We have tons of material for you guys, so thanks for joining us. A lot of what Charles and I talked about today is in the book Peak.
Yes, correct? Peak by Anders Ericsson.
Amazing book. I would highly recommend that. A lot of the things we talked about, purposeful practice, deliberate practice, and that's it. And next week, we will be sending out information for you guys to join us about habits and habit forming and how we can do a whole bunch of change to achieve results. Change. Okay, thank you so much, you guys.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Be well.